It's December 4th, 2023, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. So we're going to begin the second of our evening live classes for classical mathematics. These live classes in the evenings are open to all students, but they're really intended for adults. So we're going to get into things at a more mature level than I normally would with the students. So as we go through this, I just want to encourage you to feel free to ask questions that get practical about adult life. It's not so much academic or just related to school studies and things like that. These are practical studies. Ultimately, the goal of these studies is to become good men, good human beings. And so if you see places as we go along where you feel like there's an issue, a practical issue that applies or that's enlightened by something we run into, make a note of that. And then, all I ask is that once I get through the content that I'd like to share with everyone each meeting, so I can have a recording and I can just offer something that's beneficial for everybody. We can stay afterwards and chat as long as anyone would like. So just keep a note of questions or issues that pop up that you'd like to get into. And then once we finish going through the material that I plan each week, we can just go wherever those discussions lead us, as we have after previous meetings. So tonight, what I'd like to do, last week, I provided an introduction to the Quadrivium. We looked at a bunch of different documents. That video was that meeting was recorded and is available on YouTube. All of these videos are also available on Vimeo if you'd like them without ads and all of the YouTube nonsense. If you just go to vimeo.com, I'll share this link real quick. Vimeo.com/classical liberal arts. If you use that link, you can access all the same videos, just without all of the YouTube stuff. So I would recommend that. But we did some introductory stuff last week, and this week we're going to get into Nicomachus's Arithmetic, the first lesson. I'm sorry, it's been a busy night. We're going to get into the first lesson of Nicomachus, and there's just lots of stuff in there that I'd like to open up and get into, while also doing a little bit of review work for what we talked about last week, in case anyone wasn't there. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. The other night we had a problem. Friday night we had a problem with my screen share. So hopefully everything will be okay tonight. Can you just give me a quick yes if you can see my screen, the document on my screen? We had a little trouble last on Friday. Yeah, everything good? Okay, thank you. All right, so what I shared last week, thank you. What I shared last week was I took book 7 of Plato's Republic and I boiled it down to content that covers just one page. So we can keep an eye as we go through this study of classical arithmetic and the other arts as well. I want us to keep this document in front of us, because the danger with classical mathematics is that it just turns into a modern college course, which is just trivia. Students start to get wrapped up in esoteric language and obscure details, and they forget that the point is to ascend in contemplation. They forget the whole philosophical purpose of these studies, and they just get lost in trying to, like in the book of Acts, when it talks about St. Paul preaching to the Greeks, it says that the people in Athens, all they did was seek for something new. They were always just seeking for some new idea, new word, new information, some obscure thing to share. And much of modern academia is motivated by this desire to appear like you've got some kind of secret, obscure knowledge about things that other people don't have. And that's just not the purpose of these studies. They're practical. They're speculative in the sense that we seek to gain science or scientific knowledge. But the purpose of gaining that knowledge is to turn around and come back down and put it into practice and live according to wisdom. So all of these studies are practical, and I'm going to make sure they always stay practical, because I'm not interested in any esoteric, college-like philosophical nonsense. Now, I'm interested in this stuff for the sake of virtue and life, and I think that's what actually makes these studies interesting. The reason why classics departments are dying and disappearing in modern universities is because they've just become academic, idle academic activities with no real purpose. The reason why the Classical Liberal Arts Academy has had some success, and I think will continue to have success, is because we don't allow that to happen. We stay focused on the real ends of classical studies, which is virtue and human happiness. So I want to keep this document in front of us. I want us to constantly be going back to this document, because Plato, through Socrates, explains to us what the end of classical mathematical studies is. And as long as we keep this in view, we'll actually understand what these mathematicians are talking about. First of all, we'll understand what they're talking about, because they're not trying to be obscure or esoteric or weird or anything like that. They're practical men. The philosophers saw their philosophy as leading them to happiness. That's what they were seeking. They were seeking wisdom for the sake of happiness. And this pursuit of mathematical knowledge, they pursued it as a means to happiness. Pythagoras was trying to become happy. He was trying to lead his disciples to happiness. Plato was trying to lead his disciples to happiness and become happy himself. Aristotle was trying to lead men, as many as possible, to happiness, as he explains in Ethics, which we'll get into. So we've got to remember that this has a practical end. There's a practical purpose. And, unfortunately, I don't include it in this document here, but if you are to read Book 7 of Plato's Republic, which I recommend if you have time, the context of this talk on mathematics is the education of the men who will lead the Republic, who will lead the state. The best men, the leaders, are the guardians of the state. And what Plato's explaining, or Socrates is explaining, is that the goal is to lead these men, who he refers to as the best minds in this opening line here, to lead them to this contemplative life, bring them to this place where they enjoy the fruits and the goal of philosophy, and then force them to return and serve the people as leaders in the state. The reason why they believe that that's the way that it should work is because, first of all, they believe that by leading them to wisdom, the men will be happy. They'll be self-sufficiently happy in themselves through their contemplative life. And they won't want to be involved in politics. They'll have to be dragged down from the mountain, as it were, and made to serve the state in temporal affairs. And what Plato argues through Socrates is that that's the disposition that makes for good rulers. They're men who don't want to be rulers. They would rather be alone in a room praying or meditating or reflecting, studying philosophy, things like that. Those are the men who become the just and good rulers, because they have no interest in temporal affairs. If you think about what Christ teaches in the gospel, he teaches his disciples to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and not to seek the things the Gentiles seek after. And Jesus was saying that to his disciples, but also to his apostles, who were going to become the leaders of his church. He was telling them, I want you to become men who are not concerned with the stuff that the Gentiles seek after, but you seek first the kingdom of heaven and God's righteousness. All the things that you need will be provided to you as you do that. And that's the mindset which will allow you to become the kind of leaders that the church needs. And he goes on to talk about this all through the Gospels. Men who don't lord their authority over others, men who wash others' feet, who come into the world not to be served, but to serve. That disposition of mind, that selfless service to others, is only possible for people who are separated from material cares and ambitions, and are sort of serving the material material ends out of obligation, out of necessity, rather than out of any ambition. And you can compare that to the political mess we have today, where politics is actually the path to all kinds of wealth, where people go in with moderate means and they come out billionaires. You know, that's sort of modern political machine, which is fueled by ambition. It's the opposite of everything that Plato teaches in the Republic. So the context of this talk of mathematical studies was the formation of the ideal political leaders, the guardians of the state. By leading them to contemplation, they would lose all interest in temporal affairs, but they would be required to go down, to descend, as it were, and serve others with that disinterested mindset that would actually make them good rulers, good and just rulers. So that was the context of this originally. We read that first line: the best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good, and then they must descend, as it were, and go serve people. Yesterday or Sunday, I posted a talk on contemplation. I don't know if any of you got to listen to that. It's new, so probably not, but I talked about this idea of contemplation and how it relates to the Christian life in general, how it relates to the incarnation, the whole idea that I gave a couple examples, like the scene at the Transfiguration, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up onto the mountain, where they're in the presence of Moses and Elijah. Christ manifests his glory. They're there on the mountain. And what does Peter say? Peter isn't eager to get back to his temporal duties. He says, Lord, it's good for us to be here. That's the delight in the contemplative life we see in St. Peter at the Transfiguration. But they have to go back down. They have to go back down in order to carry out the work that they're called to do. Another good example is Moses in the Old Testament. God calls Moses up onto the mountain. He's separated from the people. He's in the presence of God, speaking to God face to face. He's given the law. He's sort of given the end of contemplation, which is the knowledge of God and his will. But then Moses is sent back down the mountain to deal with the people. And of course, they're like worshiping idols, and Moses is smashing the tablet. That's the life of a wise man. He's got to pursue that contemplative happiness, that beatific vision, or some part of the beatific vision, as St. Thomas says about contemplation. But he's got to go back down into the mess and serve others, and that's the right disposition for doing so. Moses's fault was that he was impatient. He ended up not being allowed to enter the promised land because of that impatience. But Moses is another example of this pattern of going up the mountain into the presence of God, being happy to be there, and then coming down from the mountain in order to serve others. In our Dominican formation, we learned that the first commandment, to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, is fulfilled by contemplation, by seeking God through study and prayer and meditation, devoting ourselves to God. And then the second command, to love our neighbor as ourselves, is to come down from that contemplation and share the fruits of our contemplation with others. So we just see this pattern of ascending and descending. In Christ, we don't see the ascending, because he's God and he dwells in the presence of the Father from the beginning, but we see the idea of Christ himself descending to come down and to serve men and to offer his life for others. And St. Paul in Philippians 2 tells us that we ought to have the mind in us which was in Christ, who emptied himself and took upon himself the form of a servant voluntarily, out of charity. So we see that process, that rising to all of these eternal, sublime, transcendent truths and realities, and then coming down with that wisdom to serve the temporal needs and affairs of men. If you go through saint biographies, or not even saint biographies, but even biographies of virtuous men in the past, you always notice that the virtuous men are called into some public service. They're called to be a bishop. They're called to be a political leader or something like that. And virtuous men always try to get out of it. They're never excited about that vocation to some position of material responsibility or temporal responsibility. They always try to find a way out of it, and they're forced. Usually saints end up being commanded as a matter of obedience to take different positions, because if they could stay out of it and stay in their tranquil contemplative life, they would prefer to do so. But they're obligated to go and serve and commanded to go and serve. So if we don't keep that in mind as the focus of all of these studies and what these men themselves were interested in, we're just lost in nonsense academic stuff. And one of my biggest challenges in the academy is resisting that kind of stuff, because it's just not what I'm interested in. I don't desire to try to pretend we're all just a bunch of nerds into all kinds of, obscure information and talk about whatever the weirdest thing we can find in any of these books. I'm studying these books because I want to understand wisdom. I want to understand the contemplative life, because I want to be able to live a devout life in my regular temporal affairs as a Catholic layman. So this document here from Plato, I think, will keep us grounded in this by always keeping the purpose of these studies in front of our eyes. And to be honest, if we get into discussions and the discussions start to take these idle academic routes, I'm just going to change the subject because I'm not interested in it. All right. So the goal of philosophy is to become happy. The goal of the means by which we become happy is virtue, is by actually becoming good human beings. And these studies, according to the ancient philosophers, according to Pythagoras, according to Plato and Socrates and many others, these mathematical studies are a part of the means by which we do that. And remember that this tradition was established in history before Christianity in God's providence. So just as we like to talk about development of doctrine in the Catholic Church, there was also a development of human knowledge, generally speaking, through the world. There was a development of human knowledge that was a necessary part of salvation history. We can't discount this. The gospel, Christ himself came into the world at a necessary moment in human history where, as he himself said, all things were ready. The field was white for harvest. That was true both in Israel with respect to the Jewish religion, but it was also true in the world with respect to philosophical knowledge that was available at that time, the government that was established and maintained by the Roman Empire. Everything was ready for the coming of Christ and for the founding of the church, not just religion in Israel, but everything, philosophy, government, every part of human life had developed to the point where the times were at hand and the time was fulfilled for the church to be established. And it's no coincidence that the church ended up being centered at Rome, at the center of the secular world. So when we get into this philosophy, ancient Babylonian mathematical philosophy, Egyptian philosophy, Pythagorean philosophy, Platonic philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy, what we see is a development of human wisdom and understanding that then welcomes the coming of Christ, welcomes the gospel when it comes, and allows it to be disseminated far more efficiently than it ever could have been disseminated without that development. And it's disseminated also by means of those things. We look at the church fathers. If you go back through church history and look at the fathers, it's no coincidence that most of those men who ended up being the leaders of the Christian church were classically educated, philosophically minded men. That's not coincidental. That was a necessary condition. The philosophical education of Catholic men became the prerequisite for qualifications for the ministry, for ordination to the office of a bishop, eventually of priests, and so on. So there's no way to separate philosophy from the life of the Catholic Church or from the Catholic faith. They're bound up together in history and in the doctrine as well. And we've got to look back and respect these things. This is why in church history, the ancient philosophers were respected. They were referred to as virtuous pagans. I talked about this, I don't know, maybe in the Understanding Classical Catholic Education book, but Seneca, the Roman philosopher, was included in St. Jerome's book of the lives of illustrious men. These pagan philosophers were respected by Catholics, by church fathers, as good men who just happened to live before the Christian era. So when we get to this older philosophy, when we talk about Pythagoreanism, we talk about Platonism, no, it's not sufficient to be a Platonist today, because Platonism was a stage in the development of human philosophy, just as it's not appropriate to live in the 21st century as a Catholic and only subscribe to the teachings that were established in the church in the 6th century. That wouldn't be proper for the Catholic life. The same thing is true philosophically. Philosophy continued to develop, and we're going to study that development so that we as individuals can basically form ourselves. We can form ourselves by developing this philosophical knowledge in the same way that the entire human race was formed in history, to come to a place where the entire human race was properly disposed for the coming of Christ and the gospel at that point in human history. Our philosophical studies are intended, the philosophical education of our own children is intended to prepare them for the gospel in the same way that the entire world was prepared in human history. So we're sort of going through the history of the development of human knowledge, just like the church goes through the life of Christ in the church calendar. In education, we're basically recreating the development of human knowledge that took place through history in the individual life of every student to prepare them for the gospel. That's pretty profound to think about it, but that's the purpose of education, to bring to the child the same development of thought and wisdom that was brought through, however many thousands of years in the history of human philosophy. So we're picking up here with Pythagorean mathematical education, and we're going to try to understand how that helps us in this ascent towards wisdom. But we're also getting into Platonism, which takes it a step further, then into Aristotelianism, and all the way on into the Catholic faith. But this document here, which summarized the 7th book, and it's dealing with the 4 mathematical arts, I'm going to keep this in front of us every time we meet to keep us grounded and focused on the true purpose of these studies. So just to go through this real quick, because we're going to talk about arithmetic tonight. Plato said that the philosopher, because he has to rise out of the sea of change, I would hope that you know what that phrase means by now, to rise out of the sea of change and lay hold of true being, things that exist truly and unchangeably. In order to do that, he must be an arithmetician. He must carry on the study until they see the nature of numbers with the mind only. That is, abstract the idea of numbers from material things and contemplate the nature of numbers only. This will be the easiest way for her to pass from becoming, which is the undesirable state of life in this world, from becoming, constantly changing, to truth and being, that which is unchangeable. Arithmetic has a very great and elevating effect if it's done rightly, not if it's done as modern schools do it, not if it's done for business or for calculation or for practical application. Arithmetic has a very great and elevating effect, compelling the soul to reason about abstract number and rebelling against the introduction of visible or tangible objects into the argument. This knowledge may be truly called necessary, necessitating, as it clearly does, the use of pure intelligence in the attainment of pure truth. That's the goal of the study of classical arithmetic. And if we're not progressing towards that goal, if those are not the things we're talking about and those are not the things we're doing, then we're just not studying arithmetic in this philosophical sense. But as far as these classes and our meetings are concerned, this is what we're seeking. We're not talking about any kind of modern practical arithmetic for business or work or college preparation or anything else. We're talking about the pursuit of wisdom, and we're simply using arithmetic as one means by which we easily, like Plato says, easily make this ascent from the sea of change to true being. So that's the goal. If we're not doing that, if that's not what we're talking about and that's not what we're working on, then it's just academic nonsense. So I'm going to try to keep us grounded here as we go through these studies. So that's what I want to focus on. Plato's explanation of the purpose of arithmetic. And remember, this is Socrates talking. So if anyone wants to talk about the Socratic method or any of that nonsense in modern circles today, this is Socrates. This is what Socrates actually talked about. And if the idea of the Socratic method doesn't address these issues, then we can be sure it's not the real Socratic method. So anyway, let's get to Nicomachus. The other night I shared a chronology just so we can see these names and understand who and what we're talking about and when they were working. Nicomachus is way down here in the 1st century. So this is what mathematics looked like in the time of the apostles. When St. Paul, I mean, what was St. Paul killed? Like 67 AD, somewhere around there, 65, 67 AD. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. The apostle John lived until 100 AD. That's when Nicomachus was alive and writing. So this introduction to arithmetic, I mean, if any of the apostles were interacting with the schools or the philosophers alive at the time, this was the state of mathematical studies at that point in time. So we're talking 60 to 120 AD, the life of Nicomachus. And we're going to read a book that he wrote called The Introduction to Arithmetic. He was himself friendly towards Pythagoreanism. He understood Plato's idea of arithmetic. And as we read his Introduction to Arithmetic again, if we're not seeing in his book those things that Socrates or Plato talked about, then we're missing the whole point. If we don't see the things that he's talking about, we're missing the whole point. And remember what they were. The goal was to compel the soul to reason about abstract number. That was the goal of this study, to carry on the study until they see the nature of numbers with the mind only. If that's not what we're doing when we read Nicomachus's work on arithmetic, we're missing his point, because that was the purpose of that study, and he certainly understood that as an ancient philosopher, as we're going to see by what he writes for us. Okay, so let's make sure we keep that as our focus. So Nicomachus was writing in the 1st and 2nd century AD, more like the 2nd century AD, since this was probably closer to the end of his life. So around 100 AD. And we'll see as he gets started that he makes mention of Pythagoras, who was around 500 BC. So keep Pythagoras linked to 500 BC. That's a good date to remember for Pythagoras. And Nicomachus, we can think of him as being 100 AD, so 600 years after Pythagoras. And you can see the philosophers that were in line between Nicomachus and Pythagoras. And these are the philosophers that he's going to be referring to as the ancients. Okay, for him, They were ancient. Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, they were the ancient philosophers to Nicomachus, even though Nicomachus is ancient to us. So having said that, looking at the dates, we can get into this first book of Nicomachus's Introduction. And what we find in this first chapter is Nicomachus trying to draw our attention to exactly what we just read about in Plato. He's going to explain to us this Pythagorean or ancient idea of philosophy and how it relates to mathematics. And this whole study is going to be an attempt to try to pursue with our minds a meditation on pure number. And that may just sound unattractive or uninteresting, but when you understand the purpose of it, the purpose is not for us to just become expert mathematicians and talk about numbers all the time. Arithmetic was explained to be the easiest way for the soul to learn to make this ascent. And it's not for the sake of mathematics we do this. It's for the sake of philosophy in general. It's for the sake of what comes next. Remember, Plato, at the end of that passage, he says, this is just the beginning. Let me show you real quick. At the end of this passage, I'm sorry if this is small, just bear with me here. He says, when all these studies reach the point of intercommunion and connection with one another and come to be considered in their mutual affinities, then will the pursuit of them have a value for our objects. Otherwise, there's no profit in them. And then he concludes with this, all of this is but the prelude to the actual strain which we have to learn. So all of this mathematical study, this isn't the top of the mountain. This is the bottom of the mountain. This is just the beginning of philosophy. These are like the initial steps by which we begin to make an ascent to the place where we're really trying to get to. For Plato and Socrates, they thought that their dialectical contemplation was the top of the mountain. Aristotle proved them wrong. Aristotle showed them the mountain gets higher. And then Aristotle and his followers thought that they had reached the top of the mountain, but then with the coming of Christ into the world, at the time of St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas showed everyone that no, that's not the height of the mountain either. The height of the mountain requires the addition of theology on top of everything else. St. Thomas explains that in the very first question of the Summa Theologica. So that's where we want to get. We want to get ourselves to the top of Mount Theology, as it were. And that's why, sometimes when I present the curriculum, I use the image of a mountain and sort of show the arts going up the mountain. That's the idea. But it doesn't mean, and this is what modern Christians get wrong, it doesn't mean that you can just jump into theology and say, hey, look, we're at the top of the mountain. That's not how it works. You don't even understand what theology is talking about unless you make this ascent through philosophy and understand what it means to be contemplative in the first place. So it's learning through a classical education when kids are, 14 years old, beginning to learn to be contemplative and then making reasonable, like age-appropriate steps towards contemplative life, starting with arithmetic and geometry, because they're the easiest entry points for this ascent, and then continuing to work up through philosophical studies, up into theological studies, and ultimately to the contemplative Catholic life, which is where we find the saints. We find them at the top of this mountain, not just being a bunch of arrogant theologians with degrees, babbling about systematic theology. That's not what we find the saints doing. We find the saints, including St. Albert the Great, including St. Thomas Aquinas, including St. Bonaventure, we find them as contemplatives. They're not just seminary professors who can rattle off systematic theology. That's not the end. In fact, that may miss the whole point, and that may actually be down towards the bottom of the mountain. But at the top of the mountain, we find contemplatives like St. Thomas Aquinas. It's no surprise that we find St. Thomas Aquinas simultaneously teaching theology at the highest level, but also writing mystical prayers and hymns, because those two things, true theology and that contemplative mysticism, they go together. And that's what was proven through the life of St. Thomas. What makes him so special was his union of those two things. All right, so we want to make sure we keep in mind what the purpose is, that mathematics is just the beginning of these things, okay? So let's get into Nicomachus here. And as I said, as we go through this, bear with me as I just read through it and make some comments and try to keep us focused on those things. And then if any questions or issues come up, we can tear into anything once I'm done. It's about 9:39, 9:40 now, so I'll try to read through this, because I think that once you've got that background in mind, if you can keep it in mind, which is the difficult part, keep it in mind, you'll see that what he's talking about here is very, very simple, easy to understand. It's just that most people who come into this, they have no idea where he's even coming from, what he's talking about. And then you get all kinds of cuckoo interpretations and explanations that just have nothing to do with philosophy. So let's read chapter 1 of Nicomachus's first book of the Introduction. He writes, "The ancients, who under the leadership of 500 BC Pythagoras, under the leadership of Pythagoras, first made science systematic, defined philosophy as the love of wisdom." Seems pretty simple. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. Indeed, the name itself, and as far as etymology is concerned, the name itself, philosophy, means the love of wisdom. And before Pythagoras, all who had knowledge were called wise indiscriminately. Any kind of skill or knowledge, those men were called wise. A carpenter, for example, a cobbler, a helmsman, and in a word, anyone who was versed in any art or handicraft was called wise. That was common before Pythagoras, and Pythagoras said, we need to stop this. These men, carpenters and cobblers and helmsmen, these are not wise men. This is not what wisdom is. And some people today would object to that, and they would try to defend the craftsmen against this kind of criticism. But this is biblical criticism, and I'd like to just share a passage. In Ecclesiasticus, which is the book of Sirach, let me just get there real quick. In the book of Sirach, and I mention this all the time, so if you pay attention to any of the talks I give, you'll already know this stuff. But in Sirach, chapter 38, verse 25, Sirach 38:25, we read about this same distinction that Pythagoras made. Okay, it's being made in the Jewish scriptures. We read in verse 25, the wisdom of a scribe, that is a man who studies the law of God, a man who contemplates theology. The wisdom of a scribe comes by his time of leisure. He that is less in action shall receive wisdom. So it's this idea of devoting oneself to abstract contemplation that is the means of wisdom. The ancients also taught that that's why philosophy developed in Egypt, because they had a class of priests and they were materially prosperous, and philosophy was able to develop there. The wisdom of a scribe comes by his time of leisure. He that is less in action shall receive wisdom. And then we have this criticism of mechanical arts and mechanical labor. With what wisdom shall he be furnished that holdeth the plough, and that glorieth in the goad, that driveth the oxen, and is occupied in their labors? His whole talk is about the offspring of his bulls. He shall give his mind up to furrows, and his care is to give the cattle their food. So every craftsman and workmaster that labors night and day, he who makes graven seals and by his continual diligence varies the figures, he shall give his mind to the resemblance of the picture, by watching shall finish his work. And then he goes on to the smith and how the blacksmith does the same thing. He explains how the potter does the same thing. goes through these mechanical arts and says they're not going to be able to come to the wisdom of the scribe, because that wisdom comes through leisure, through contemplation. Then in verse 35, 35 here, it says, all these men, all these craftsmen trust to their hands, and everyone is wise in his own art. And there you see that use of wise that Nicomachus is talking about. Everyone is wise in his own art. Without these men, a city is not built. They're necessary, and they shall not dwell nor walk about therein, and they shall not go up into the assembly. Upon the judge's seat, however, these men shall not sit. The ordinance of judgment, these men shall not understand, neither shall they declare discipline or judgment, and they shall not be found where parables are spoken. They shall not be found in the places where wisdom is discussed. Yet they shall strengthen the state of the world, and their prayer shall be in the work of their craft, applying their soul and searching in the law of the Most High. So you've got this distinction that Nicomachus mentions in this opening chapter. Rather than respond to this, as I think many would today, and object to it, we see the same distinction is made in sacred scripture. So this isn't anything radical or contrary to Christian teaching. Nicomachus says, before Pythagoras, all men who had knowledge were called wise indiscriminately. A carpenter, a cobbler, a helmsman, anyone who is versed in any art or handicraft. Pythagoras, however, restricted the title of wise man so as to apply to the knowledge and comprehension of reality. And this is the first important topic to consider in this book. Pythagoras restricted the title of wise man so as to apply to the knowledge and comprehension of what he calls reality, things that are real. If you want to just read some popular book that gets into this concept, I recommend The Great Divorce by C.S. Lewis. If you've never read The Great Divorce, in The Great Divorce, C.S. Lewis tries to illustrate this idea of reality. If any of you have read that, you'll know how he does that. But it's an interesting attempt to try to, give some legs to this idea of reality, because in our society, in modern society, we're taught, and our kids are taught, the opposite idea of what's real. They're taught that things that are material, things that can be observed, experimentation, and so on, that's reality. Seeing is believing. They're taught that that's what's real. And we wonder why they're screwed up and there's no vocations and things like that. It's because they're taught the opposite of wisdom. Pythagoras taught men that reality was found in those things that are unchanging and invisible and eternal. We teach children today in our society that reality is in things that are material, visible, capable of observation, and so on. We teach the opposite of wisdom to our children. But Pythagoras had the idea that reality is that which endures unchanging. That's what's real. And it's common sense to think about that. If you ever look at a video that shows what do they call them? Time-lapse videos, where you see like the clouds moving through a valley or something, and the weather comes and goes, and you see this time-lapse video. What becomes really clear is that the mountains and the valley, those are the things that are real. They abide, they stay unchanging. And the weather comes and goes. The sun comes and goes. The stars move across the sky. The clouds move. The rain falls, comes and goes. All of the weather, all of these accidents of the natural world come and go. But the mountains stay as the image of what is real. That's what's real. The land and the mountains, that's real. The water of the rivers, it's transitory. It comes and goes. The weather comes and goes, and so on. In Stoic philosophy, there was a saying that regardless of what the weather is like, the sun is always shining. That idea of reality. The sun is always shining. All of this change, all of the changing weather and this and that, it's all just appearances. The sun is always shining. So that's the Pythagorean, the wise man's idea of reality, that idea of that permanence or steadfastness, unchangeability, and so on. That's what Pythagoras refers to here as reality. Pythagoras restricted the title of wise to apply to the knowledge and comprehension of reality, which none of these craftsmen had, or that they could have if they were philosophical, but not by the virtue of their craft. He called the knowledge of the truth in this the only wisdom, and naturally designated the desire and pursuit of this knowledge to be philosophy, the desire for wisdom, the desire for the knowledge of reality, the things which actually endure and do not change. That's what's real. Everything else is appearance. He, Pythagoras, is more worthy of credence or trust than those who have given other definitions of philosophy, because he does two things. First of all, his definition, his explanation of philosophy makes sense of the word itself. That's what the word actually means. And also explains the thing that is defined. So Pythagoras has rightly defined philosophy as the love of wisdom. Now we've got a couple vocabulary items. You'll notice that they're set in quotes. Wisdom, Pythagoras defined as the knowledge or science of the truth in real things, things that do not change. He conceived science, the idea of science, to be a steadfast and firm apprehension of the underlying substance of things, a steadfast and firm apprehension of the underlying substance in things, not the accidental appearances, not the changing appearances, but the underlying substance. And he defined real things to be those which continue uniformly and the same in the universe and never depart from their existence or from the condition in which they exist. Their subsistence would be a better word there. All right, so those three terms, wisdom, science, and real things, defined according to Pythagorean philosophy or ancient philosophy. He goes on to say these real things would be things immaterial, not material things. So what exactly are they? And this sentence right here, in this whole first chapter, it's really quite simple, but this one sentence can be a little tricky. You've got to understand the concept to know what it means. So let me just read it slowly and then make sure it's clear. Real things would be things immaterial. So not material, not the changeable, moving things that appear to our senses. Those are not the real things. Things that are immaterial, which by sharing in the substance of which everything else that exists under the same name and is so called is said to be this particular thing and exists. That sentence there is complicated. That's some real word salad if you're trying to read that and understand it. But if you go through it slowly and just parse it all out and read it piece by piece, what he's saying is real things are not the individuals that we observe. For example, a real man is not Socrates. He's an example. He's an individual man. But that's not what man in the real sense is. Man is the underlying substance of what we see in Socrates and what we see in Aristotle and what we see in a woman and what we see in a child. Man, understood as a real thing, understood philosophically, is the essence of man, which can be said to be seen in every individual man. But every individual man is not the definition of man itself. So it's that idea of substance, which we're going to get into when we study Aristotle's categories in reasoning. So this idea of real things, things immaterial, so not the visible things, not the actual individuals that we perceive with our senses. but the immaterial things that share in the substance of which all of the things that exist under the same name, that share the same name, are said to be this thing. And again, that's a mouthful, but what he's talking about here is what Aristotle's going to talk about in the opening chapter of Categories and Reasoning. It's that idea of what it means for terms to be synonymous, to have the same name and the same meaning. That's what we're trying to get to, the substance, the real essence of things, and focus our minds and gain knowledge of that, not be distracted by individuals. Modern science does exactly the opposite. It says that these underlying substances, these immaterial realities, don't even exist. They're just figments of our own imagination, and all that exists are the individuals, and that truth is found through observation of material things. It's the opposite of this. Moving on. Bodily material things are forever involved in a continuous flow and change. That's the idea of the sea of change that Plato talked about. Material things are forever involved in continuous flow and change, in imitation of the nature and peculiar quality of that eternal matter and substance, which has been from the beginning and which was all changeable and variable throughout. The bodiless things, however, which are the realities, of which we conceive in connection with matter, that is, their qualities, their attributes. The bodiless things, they're either substance or attributes. And if you don't know what that means, the difference between substance and attributes, then you need to study classical reasoning, because that's where we learn that. The bodiless things of which we conceive in connection with the matter, the material things, such as, and he gives us a list here, qualities, quantities, configurations, largeness and smallness or size, equality, relations, actualities, dispositions, places, times, those things whereby the qualities found in each body, that is, in each material thing, are comprehended, these things are the immovable and unchangeable things, and they share in and partake of the affections or changes of the bodily things only accidentally, as attributes of those things, the bodies to which they belong. Now, it is with such things that wisdom is concerned. But we're also interested in material things, but only accidentally, because they participate, or they're the bodies in which these eternal things actually have their existence in the material world. So now, again, that's a passage that needs to be read and reread a few times, but the concept is very simple, and really all that Nicomachus is doing is repeating the idea 2 or 3 times in that first chapter. The idea is that wisdom is the knowledge of truth in real things. Real things are the things that don't change. Now, in modern Christian thought, modern Christian culture, we've got an oversimplification of this idea. When we talk about immaterial things in modern Christianity, this is like Protestantish ideas. We talk about immaterial things, we think about God. We say God is an immaterial thing. We say angels are immaterial things. The Holy Spirit is an immaterial thing. And we associate spirits with immaterial things, but that's not what Nicomachus is talking about. He's not talking about spirits. He's not talking about angels or God or the Holy Spirit, even though they're examples of bodiless things. Angels, for example, are not the same quality of invisible substance as God is. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about this overly simplified Protestant idea that material things are things that are worldly and exist in this world, and immaterial things are spiritual things, angels and God himself. That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about our soul versus our body. That's not what he's talking about. We can see that what he's talking about in this middle sentence here is something different. He's talking about things that exist in our mind. He's talking about things, he's talking about ideas that we can comprehend by means of contemplation. Things like qualities, quantities, relations, places and times, and things like that. So the reason why I want to stress that is because you're going to see people who don't know what they're talking about, who get into philosophy, explaining this as if Nicomachus or philosophers are calling us to think about God rather than worldly stuff. And that false division of God and the world as if they are two separate things, that's got to do with dualism. That's not true philosophy. That's actually a part of false philosophy. That idea of body and soul as these two opposing things, and there's God and the devil, and they fight each other, and there's the world and the spiritual world, and they're fighting each other. That's dualism. That's false philosophy. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is more subtle. It's more complicated than that. This is philosophical. And as I said, we'll really get into this stuff when we talk about classical reasoning. But don't assume that this is like this simple, modern, spiritual world versus the kingdom of God, or the city of God versus the city of man. That's not what this is talking about. This is philosophical language talking about things that exist in the soul unchangeable and are the objects of contemplation, as opposed to material things outside the soul, which are constantly changing. It's not calling anything good or bad. It's not saying material things are bad and these invisible things are good. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that there are two different kinds of things, and that the qualities of these invisible things is worthy of contemplation and is the means by which we ascend through contemplation from the constant vexation and confusion of the world, which is a source of constant trouble for us, to this tranquil life of contemplative philosophy, which is wisdom. So don't allow this to be read with some kind of dualistic philosophy. That's not what it's teaching. And don't blame Platonism for that either, because that's really not what Plato was teaching. People who are false believers, who have misunderstandings of philosophy, will associate Platonism with dualism, and that's just not true. That's not even what Plato or Pythagoras or Nicomachus are talking about. So just be careful. But that brings us through chapter 1, and you can see that all Nicomachus is talking about in this first chapter is the concept of contemplation and fixing our mind on those things which do not change, immaterial things which have a relation to bodily things because they participate in bodily things as attributes, or if they're substances, they are the essences of those things themselves. So there's a little bit of complicated philosophical language in there, but we're going to understand that much more clearly when we study classical reasoning. But that's the first chapter in classical arithmetic, and what you see is the arithmeticians are saying to their students, listen, this isn't about calculation. This isn't about college math. This isn't about the SAT. We're talking about wisdom. This is about learning the truth in real things. That's what arithmetic is about. And so right from the beginning, we see Nicomachus being a true philosopher, helping us to focus on the goal of this study. And we have to make sure that as we get into it, every single thing we read in classical arithmetic or classical geometry is tethered to this first chapter, and we don't allow it to fly off and wander into craziness. So that's all for this first chapter of Nicomachus's Introduction to Arithmetic. That's what I wanted to share with you this week. So we can talk about any of those issues you'd like to get into, or if anything's not clear, or you see in there something that triggers in you a thought about some other application or practical use of this, I'm happy to talk about that. But I'm going to stop there for tonight, turn this recording off, and then we'll be free to talk about anything you'd like. All right, so that is that.